All right, My Antonia by Willa, Cather, novel about life in the Nebraska plains in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Willa Cather moved from Virginia to Nebraska when she was a little girl, and she wrote a number of novels about this part of the country, this time period. Main characters are Jim Burton, he's the first person narrator, and then Antonia Shimerda. So Jim is an American, Antonia is an immigrant from Bohemia. Her parents and her move to Nebraska when she's very young. And the novel tracks their lives and their relationship and the town they live in across a number of decades. So jumping into it with my favorite excerpts from My Antonia. So first one is Jim Burton, narrator speaking. In the beginning of the book, says, "The earth was warm under me, and warm as I crumbled it through my fingers. I was entirely happy. Perhaps we feel like that when we die and become a part of something entire, whether it is sun and air or goodness and knowledge. At any rate, that is happiness, to be dissolved into something complete and great. When it comes to one, it comes as naturally as sleep." Much later in the novel, when Jim and Antonia are getting ready to go their separate ways after many years, Jim goes, "Do you know, Antonia, since I've been away, I think of you more often than anyone else in this part of the world. The idea of you is a part of my mind. You influence my likes and dislikes, all my tastes, hundreds of times when I don't realize it. You really are a part of me." She turned her bright, believing eyes to me, and the tears came up in them slowly. "How can it be like that when you know so many people, and when I've disappointed you so? Ain't it wonderful, Jim, how much people can mean to each other?" Next one. Still on Jim and Antonia. "As we walked homeward across the fields, the sun dropped and lay like a great golden globe in the low west. While it hung there, the moon rose in the east, as big as a cartwheel, pale silver and streaked with rose color, thin as a bubble or a ghost moon. For 5, perhaps 10 minutes, the two luminaries confronted each other across the level land, resting on opposite edges of the world. In that singular light, every little tree and shock of wheat, every sunflower stalk and clump of snow on the mountain, drew itself up high and pointed. The very clods and furrows in the field seemed to stand up sharply. I felt the old pull of the earth, the solemn magic that comes out of those fields at nightfall. I wished I could be a little boy again and that my way could end there." We reached the edge of the field where our ways parted. I took her hands and held them against my breast, feeling once more how strong and warm and good they were, those brown hands, and remembering how many kind things they had done for me. I held them now a long while over my heart. About us it was growing darker and darker, and I had to look hard to see her face, which I meant always to carry with me, the closest, realest face under all the shadow of women's faces, at the very bottom of my memory. "I'll come back," I said earnestly, through the soft, intrusive darkness. "Perhaps you will," she said. I felt rather than saw her smile. "But even if you don't, you are here, just like my father, so I won't be lonesome." As I went back alone over that familiar road, I could almost believe that a boy and a girl ran along beside me, as our shadows used to do, laughing and whispering to each other in the grass. Antonia had always been one to leave images in the mind that did not fade. That grew stronger with time. She lent herself to immemorial human attitudes, which we recognize by instinct as universal and true. She still had something which fires the imagination and could still stop one's breath for a moment by a look or gesture that somehow revealed the meaning in common things. She was a rich mine of life. So that last quote is when Jim leaves, goes to school. Him and Antonia never have a romantic relationship. She's a bit older than him and looks after him and takes care of him. He sort of has a crush on her, but just more so forms this incredible bond through, their families weathering a lot of the hardships of life on the plains together. But he also has this sort of love and appreciation for her, even though they never marry. So he goes off, has his own life, studies, goes to college in Lincoln, and he comes back to this small town in Nebraska 20 years later, hasn't seen her in almost 2 decades. And this is the quote, the one I just read, talking about how she has changed over those 20 years, but how that spirit of hers is still alive, right? It says, she still had that something which fires the imagination, could still stop one's breath for a moment by a look or gesture that somehow revealed the meaning in common things. And I love this line at the end. I'll read the full part here. It was no wonder that her sons stood straight and tall. She was a rich mine of life. She was a rich mine of life. So throughout the book, Jim often contrasts the sort of local townspeople, the women who are just in the town who aren't immigrants, who are often sort of sheltered. And he says a line, he says they wouldn't go outside in the winter for the cold or the summer for the heat. They're sort of prim and proper. And then there's these immigrant women from, Bohemia, Czech Republic, Sweden, who had this strength to them, who were willing to buck the trends of society, and Antonia is the shining example of this. There's a few that he talks about in the novel, but Antonia is the prime example of this hardscrabble but fierce and determined category of immigrant woman who stands out. And like he says in this line here, she was a rich mine of life. I read this. I wrote in the notes on Readwise when I read this part. What a contrast to the fat, lazy, passive consumers that so many of us are in moments, certain moments I am myself here in 2021. Right, this contrast of life today, where people just want to be comfortable and consumptive, and choosing the different toppings to get on your pizza, or picking from 1,000 different shows to stream on Netflix or Hulu or HBO. Just contrasting that with this image of this hardscrabble immigrant in Nebraska, Antonia, who has a really tough life. Her father dies when she's young, and they have to bury him in a field, and she has to work and just barely scrape by, not having a lot of money, not having a lot of opportunities as an immigrant. She ultimately gets married and never leaves this town, and raises something like 8, 10, maybe even a dozen kids with a husband who falls down on his luck at times. But here's this passage towards the end of the book with Jim describing Antonia, saying that she lent herself to immemorial human attitudes, which we recognize by instinct as universal and true. He does say she was a battered woman now, not a lovely girl. She just meaning that she had grown older and more weathered with time, but she still had that something which fires the imagination, could still stop one's breath for a moment by look or gesture that somehow revealed the meaning in common things. I'll read the full quote here. She had only to stand in the orchard, to put her hand on a little crab tree and look up at the apples, to make you feel the goodness of planting and tending and harvesting at last. All the strong things of her heart came out in her body that had been so tireless in serving generous emotions. It was no wonder that her sons stood tall and straight. She was a rich mine of life. A rich mine of life. She was a rich mine of life. That image stands so starkly in contrast to the way we often behave today in our passive, fat, consumerist culture. It's this, disease of abundance. We have everything. We don't have to go live on the hardscrabble plains of Nebraska and survive cold winters with only a small fire with 8, 10 kids to feed. We don't have, for the most part, in the U.S. in 2021, we don't have to face those types of challenges. But there's this element of toughness that, if you're not careful, for most people is often lost when conditions are so comfortable. It's comfortable, things are easy, things are pleasant. But I don't know how often you get a phrase like this, describing someone's character as she was a rich mine of life. And the final quote that closes out the novel. This was the road over which Antonia and I came on that night when we got off the train at Black Hawk and were bedded down in the straw, wandering children, being taken we knew not whither. I had only to close my eyes to hear the rumbling of the wagons in the dark, and to be again overcome by that obliterating strangeness. The feelings of that night were so near that I could reach out and touch them with my hand. I had the sense of coming home to myself, and of having found out what a little circle man's experience is. For Antonia and for me, this had been the road of destiny, had taken us to those early accidents of fortune which predetermined for us all that we can ever be. Now I understood that the same road was to bring us together again. Whatever we had missed, we possessed together the precious, the incommunicable past. So again, this one of those novels that you finish it, and the weeks and months after it, you feel it in yourself. I read this when I was in Wyoming, did a 10-day solitude retreat to Wyoming and Idaho last fall. So I read this, had a huge impact on me. And then I came back to it this spring, reviewed it, did the Readwise highlights, and it hit me in another wave. And just a couple of the lines that really stood out. I mean, all the ones I read, but the one where he just describes the entire scene of the sun setting and the moon rising over the plains, and remembering being a little kid and talking about the fact that he'd come back and see Antonia another time, and that final line, as I went back alone over that familiar road, I could almost believe that a boy and a girl ran beside me, as our shadows used to do, laughing and whispering to each other in the grass. That one hits me. That one hits me hard. This one, maybe the most of all. Again, I'm repeating myself here, but Jim goes away to college, comes back, and he talks about how, hey, Antonia, since I've been away, I think of you more often than of anyone else in this part of the world. This I didn't read this part earlier. This part said, I'd have liked to have you for a sweetheart or a wife, or my mother or my sister, anything that a woman can be to a man. The idea of you is a part of my mind. You influence my likes and dislikes, all my tastes, hundreds of times when I don't realize it. You really are a part of me. Then Antonia, she turned her bright, believing eyes to me, and the tears came up in them slowly. How can it be like that when you know so many people and when I've disappointed you so? This is the line right here. Ain't it wonderful, Jim, how much people can mean to each other? And then, of course, she was a rich mine of life. Just went over that excerpt a couple times. And then the final line. For Antonia and for me, this had been the road of destiny, had taken us to those early accidents of fortune which predetermined for us all that we can ever be. Now I understood that the same road was to bring us together again. Whatever we had missed, we possessed together the precious, the incommunicable past. Stays with you after you finish it. I promise you that. My Antonia, Willa, Cather.